afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Research Forum. Great to see you all here today. It's my pleasure today to introduce our two speakers, both of whom are affiliated with the Margolis Center for Health Policy, and will be presenting today as part of our series on DCRI connected to Duke. So we're very excited to hear about the work that they're doing on real-world evidence for regulatory and payment decisions and how that connects to some of the work that we're doing here at the DCRI. Our first speaker today is Dr. Gregory Daniel, who's clinical professor at Fuqua and deputy director in the Margolis Center for Health Policy. Dr. Daniel received his PhD in pharmaceutical economics, policy, and outcomes from the University of Arizona. And prior to coming to Duke, he was managing director for evidence development and biomedical innovation at Brookings, as well as the vice president for government and academic research at Health Corps. His research interests are health outcomes and pharmacoeconomics, comparative effectiveness, and drug safety and pharmacoepi. Our second speaker is Dr. Gillian Schmidler, who's professor in the Department of Population Health Sciences and a member of the Outcomes Research Group here at the DCRI. She received her PhD in medical informatics at Stanford and was on faculty there for several years before joining the Duke faculty in 2003. She's past president of the Society for Medical Decision Making and has served as director for Duke's Evidence-Based Practice Center, which is funded by ARC, and was recently named deputy director for academics of the Margolis Center, and in that capacity will oversee development of the educational programs in the center. So please join me today in welcoming our speakers, Dr. Gillian Schmidler and Dr. Gregory Daniel.
And really just give a really brief overview of the Duke Margolis Center for those that are not familiar with it. And then Greg is actually going to jump in and do the actual meat of the seminar. But for those that don't know much about the Margolis Center and what we do, I wanted to just give a really brief overview. And certainly my hope is that there are going to be over time a lot additional collaborations between DCRI and Margolis. And so Margolis is already collaborating with a lot of different faculty that are based here at DCRI, but there is a lot more that I think we could be doing, and so I want to certainly encourage that. So just a little bit about the center. The center started in January of 2016, and it was established in part by a large gift from Bob Margolis, and it's an interesting center within the university in that it is across the entire university. It has both reports up to the provost as well as to the chancellor within the School of Medicine, and it really brings together people from across the campus. The mission of it is to look at improving, the experience of care, the health of populations, and reducing costs, and really trying to do this through both research and policy. One of the things that's unique about the Margolis Center is that we have a physical presence here on campus. We're based over in Fuqua, physically at the JB Duke Hotel, and there's an office space there. And then we have additional office space up in Washington, D.C., and so that is where Greg is physically based. We have a pretty large staff there as well. And so one of the things that's different about the Margolis Center to other health policy centers is really this having the Washington, D.C. presence, as well as the faculty and staff that are here on campus. On campus, the Margolis Center is based within Fuqua, as I mentioned, but we have faculty and staff involved from the School of Medicine, from the School of Nursing, from the Sanford School of Public Policy, from the law school, and then on the main campus. And so really across the campus, and the faculty that we're working with and the educational programs that we're doing are really trying to be cross-campus. So in terms of who's involved in the center, so Mark McClellan is our director, and then we, as Emily mentioned, we have two deputy directors. We have myself as deputy director of academics, and then Greg is the deputy director of policy, and then we also have our director of communications, Ellen de Graffenried, and then a director of operations is Amanda McBroom, who many of you knew because she used to be at DCRI as well, working with me here. And as I mentioned, we really have affiliations across all the different schools within the university. Some of these are ones that have been established quite strongly. We have actual Margolis scholars, master students that are in the Sanford School of Public Policy as well as in the law school, and we're working on collaborations with the other schools for some of the educational components, and then we have research collaborations across these different schools. Some of the areas of focus, and so Greg is going to talk about a couple of these, but there's a lot of different ones that the faculty affiliated with the Margolis Center work on. A lot of work related to payment and delivery reform, biomedical innovation, and so at the end of Greg's talk, I think he's going to talk a little bit about some of the value-based payment work that they've been doing within biomedical innovation, the real-world evidence development, and so that's what's the meat of today's session is going to be about. We have some faculty based here, both at DCRI and then within Fuqua, that are working on consumerism and behavioral economics. We have a lot of work related to stakeholder engagement. A lot of the work that we do up in the DC office is really working with different policymakers and stakeholders and some convening, and some of that builds on the long-established work from Brookings that came over to Duke when Mark and Greg and their group came here. And then, as I mentioned, we have a lot of different educational initiatives. So we have Margolis scholars that are in their first year, which are these master's students currently within law and policy that are working with Margolis, and that is expanding to medicine, nursing, and business. We have a monthly, or I guess it's a bi-weekly, it's a 2 times a month seminar on Fridays at noon that we'd love to have more folks from DCRI come over to. We have some health policy and management curriculum that are building new courses that are offered through Sanford and will be offered in conjunction with population health. And then we also have opportunities for internships and other kind of real-world experience, either within the North Carolina hub here at Duke or else up in the DC office for some health policy externships and different interning possibilities as well as projects. So the other thing is in terms of kind of where the funding for the portfolio projects within the Margolis Center goes, we have a lot of different collaborations with both foundations and then also different companies and government funders. And so here, these are a bunch of the different foundations that the group works with. And then we also have some relationships with a bunch of different companies that will really be some of the work that Greg is going to be talking about. And so Greg's going to talk about some of our real-world evidence work, but what I wanted to make sure that people are thinking about is a lot of the faculty at DCRI, especially within outcomes and other groups like that, are working on things that they haven't really been thinking about the actual policy implications of the work that they're doing. And so one of the things that I'm doing within the new role at Margolis is trying to make sure that the research that we have going on campus, that we're actually thinking about that next step. So how can we actually not only be making differences in the clinical care of patients, but then also in the policy that's influencing that. And so we want to make sure that the staff and the faculty that are involved at Margolis are getting integrated into the different research initiatives that are going on within DCRI and across campus and looking for those connections. And so it's something that, it's a different type of world to be trying to work with the speed of some of the policy things and the need to be working within kind of the state and the global and the national realm in terms of policy, but it's something where I think there's a lot of kind of untapped impact that we could be having. So we're going to have Greg talk about the work he's doing on real-world evidence, and then we'd love to have questions at the end, both about this work and then more globally about the Margolis Center. So, Greg.
All right. Thanks, Gillian. And thanks to allowing me to come and present to you. As Gillian indicated, I'm going to focus mostly on real-world evidence, real-world data and real-world evidence as it applies to a lot of the policy work that we're doing in the center with respect to drugs and devices. So with regulatory decisions on the FDA side, as well as how real-world data and evidence can support advances in payment reform. So I'm going to start out with just some overview of definitions and background with real-world evidence and data, present a bit of a framework that we're working with FDA and other stakeholders on thinking about how to generate fit-for-purpose real-world evidence development. We've launched a RWE Collaborative that's building upon this framework that I'm going to present, and further works out sort of next steps on how to improve data quality, how to improve the credibility of observational studies, all sort of with an initial focus on how this data and evidence can support regulatory decisions at the FDA side. And then we're going to change gears a little bit in the fourth section and talk about and sort of what we're seeing a lot in the media today around drug prices, particularly with gene therapies, but also with medical devices and other chronic use pharmaceuticals, and how real-world data and evidence can support more value-based payment approaches. So just starting out, I think this is DCRI, so I don't need to talk about I don't need to talk about randomized controlled trials. But really, as you all know, randomized controlled trials, more traditional trials, are the gold standard for evidence development on drugs and devices. And there's really two primary challenges that motivate the additional use of real-world evidence development, and that's one is that the evidence is really costly and time-consuming to develop. So real-world evidence may offer a more cost-effective way to develop evidence. But number two is that oftentimes the questions that decision makers are looking for, patients and making their own treatment decisions, payers making coverage and reimbursement decisions, the trials don't necessarily answer the questions that people have across the health system. Like, how do these drugs actually work in the real world? So real-world evidence and real-world data can help potentially address the costliness of evidence development, but also bring in additional, more relevant questions that can be addressed with the data. So in terms of definitions, this is very consistent with what FDA has recently put forth. In fact, they helped us with these definitions. It really starts with real-world data and what real-world data are. And so our definition is broad, but it's data relating to patient health status and or the delivery of health care, routinely collected from a variety of sources. So this is almost everything other than purposefully collected data for research in the context of a clinical trial. So it includes claims data, electronic health record data, registry data, but even more innovative data collection that is evolving now, which is wearable devices, your smartphones and the apps that you can sort of collect patient data. What to do with it, nobody really knows, but we've got some ideas. But every day there's just a new source of what could constitute real-world data. And then essentially real-world evidence is taking that data, the raw materials, and developing evidence from it. We're agnostic to whether it's good evidence or not good evidence, but it's applying rigorous research methods, research design, to that data to generate evidence. FDA's definition takes us a little bit further to say that real-world evidence can further be defined as clinical evidence regarding the use and potential benefits or risks of a medical product. But real-world evidence in general doesn't have to specify just drugs and devices. You could develop real-world evidence on basically anything, a disease management program, a new payment reform initiative. All of those things could be the subject of real-world evidence. But I think it's important to include here that real-world evidence can include randomized designs as well as observational. Many people think that real-world evidence, what you really mean is retrospective database analyses, but it's just not the case. Large pragmatic trials, simple trials that include the element of randomization can be used to develop real-world evidence, randomization in the clinical setting. But also observational, both prospective and retrospective studies as well can help develop real-world evidence. So just a little bit on why FDA is so all of a sudden interested in using real-world evidence. Both the PDUFA, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act that was signed into law last year, as well as the 21st Century Cures Act, which was signed into law in 2016, both have almost a mirror image provision for FDA, which is to develop a program for the first time in history, to look at how the FDA might more systematically include the potential for real-world evidence to inform its decision. So historically, FDA has used real-world evidence. The Sentinel system in using claims data and other electronic health record data to monitor the safety of products in the post-market setting. FDA has that, and they've been using that. As well as very rare diseases where it might be unethical to randomize, or you actually don't have a comparison group and you need to use a historical control group. That could be considered real-world evidence. But everything in the middle, which is the traditional drug approvals, new indications, labeling changes, things like that that are, that FDA's daily decision-making on medical products typically has not included a room essentially for real-world evidence. And so these provisions put FDA on the hook to start thinking about how it might use real-world evidence. And by the end of the next couple of years in 2021, FDA is on the hook for producing a guidance to industry that would explicitly say how FDA views real-world evidence and its use in regulatory decisions. On the device, so this has all been on the drug side. On the device side, FDA has a bit more experience using real-world evidence. Device registries are commonplace in the medical device world, particularly implantable devices. Claims data are not really that useful for devices because the claims data actually don't have a claim for the device. You have a claim for the procedure, and you can guess what device was used, but you can't actually go into the claims data to find out exactly which model and which brand, because UDIs, unique device identifiers, aren't in the claims data. So you kind of have to go to the electronic medical record, and for the majority of implantable devices, you actually have to go to the paper-based record and find that little sticker that has the unique code for that device. And I think you can actually look at that code and find out that there are multiple different manufacturers and devices. One code could be cotton balls, but it could also be an implantable device that a different manufacturer, because there's not a universal code system. So those codes aren't really that useful. And so as sort of I don't want to say, but I'm going to, as a Band-Aid for getting better data on devices, it really stimulated the need for registries. And also, device outcomes are very closely related to surgical technique and the procedure around the device. So it's hard to separate the device from the surgical technique and the procedure. And so claims and other sort of data sources may not collect the clinical information well. And so registries have been a pretty, and I know I said Band-Aid, but it was because that's really the only option to generate the evidence that you need for devices. So that is real-world evidence, and CDRH and Jeff Shuren over in the Device Center at FDA has gone forward to say that CDRH can really use real-world evidence across the total product lifecycle for devices, and so they've already produced a guidance on how to use real-world evidence last year, but still, this was just last year. So both sides, the device and the drug side, are fairly new to thinking about how real-world evidence could essentially be used for the regulator. So the Duke Margolis Center has been working with the FDA over the past couple of years under a cooperative agreement that we have with the agency. And one of the topics has been helping the FDA think about how it might approach these new requirements around real-world evidence development. So we formed a working group in the summer of 2015. This was before PDUFA 6 and the 21st Century Cures Act was passed, but Janet Woodcock and Commissioner Califf at the time knew this was coming, and so engaged with our center to start exploring how the agency might think about real-world evidence. And so we formed that working group in 2015. We held a couple of expert workshops and public events, as well as released a white paper that includes sort of the initial thinking of it's not a final framework, but sort of what an initial framework might look like to sort of guide decision-making around how to think about real-world evidence. And so that framework that's included in this white paper, and it's available on our website, includes, essentially it tries to answer the question that we would always get at the beginning. So we talk to people on the pharma side and talk to, other stakeholders, and everybody would essentially come down to the same question, which was, can FDA use real-world evidence? And it was such an easy answer because it depends. You just say it depends and kind of walk away. So this framework is starting to sort of maybe better answer that. Well, it depends on what. Well, we think in our planning group, and FDA is part of that too, we think that essentially there are 4 major domain areas that can help address the it depends. The first 2 are the regulatory context and the clinical context. So the regulatory context recognizes that it's not just a black and white situation, that there's not just one kind of question that the FDA, or the one kind of decision that the FDA makes. They make decisions about brand new drugs to be on the market. They make decisions about existing drugs on the market that might have a pretty well understood benefit risk profile, but for which a sponsor is seeking a new indication. Or it might be a decision related to same indication, same drug, but new information to be added to labeling. And it might be decisions related to the safety of a product as new information arises during the company's or FDA's active surveillance monitoring. So what kind of question are we talking about for FDA? And each one of those might give rise to a different set of needs on what real-world evidence can produce. Related to that is the clinical question. So not just necessarily what the actual clinical question is and can real-world evidence support that, but the clinical scenario itself. Depending on the drug that you're talking about, there might be a lot of known selection bias where, okay, well, that's a drug to treat more advanced stages of the disease, and your comparator group is first-line therapy. So automatically you have this huge selection bias where if you try to do a comparative effectiveness study or compare 2 cohorts, the one cohort is going to have sicker patients than the other one, and so automatically that's going to give rise to different results. So that's a clinical issue. Also, in terms of the number of doses, when you have a chronic drug, you have to worry about adherence and compliance and sort of how often the patient is getting refills to know if you have any issues of that, whereas a device or an injectable, a one-time injectable might have different issues that come up, and those are not necessarily comparable. So both of those taken together would sort of indicate, okay, so what then, based on all of that, and something on the clinical context, there might be a disease that is very symptomatic, and patients go in to get treated for that disease pretty frequently, versus a disease that's not symptomatic, and you have long lengths of time where patients don't have a medical encounter. And so without a medical encounter, there's, essentially looking at the traditional ways of collecting real-world data, there isn't an opportunity to collect data. So you only get data collected when a patient chooses to come in and seek care. So some clinical scenarios might give rise to a lot of that, and some may not. And so you might have a lot of missing or just inability to measure important information from patients. So then you look at, okay, so based on the regulatory question and the clinical question, what are the data considerations? Is this a regulatory question and clinical question that's going to, really get hindered from a lot of missing data or low quality data? Et cetera, benefits coverage, if you're in a health plan that steers you into one direction versus another in terms of which drug you're getting or which device, that can have some unmeasured biases in your data. And then obviously the research design and methods considerations based on that, how would you design the research? Do you need to have randomization? Can you go forward with an observational study? What kinds of analytic techniques are you using? So all of that. So all of these things essentially taken together would help you think about whether or not you have fit-for-purpose real-world evidence development. So this is the framework that we put forward, and it sort of helped to identify, okay, so this is sort of the universe of considerations that you have to make, but let's peel back a layer and go under the hood a little bit and talk about what more specifically do you need to look at in terms of data quality and research design, as well as the clinical and regulatory context. So we formed what we're calling an RWE Collaborative, so it builds upon the work that the Duke Margolis Center has been doing with FDA, and formed a RealWorld Evidence Collaborative that includes a number of companies. Many of the logos that you saw on Gillian's slide are funders of this, but it also includes payers and data and research organizations, FDA, patient groups as well, to sort of serve as a central convening point for a lot of organizations who are on their own developing real-world evidence, but there's really no sort of coordinator of all this. And what we've realized that there are a lot of companies out there, a lot of research organizations like HealthCore and Optum, that are trying to improve how real-world evidence is developed, and they're sort of in their own little silos. And what we realized is that there wasn't an organization that was sort of bringing everyone together and saying, okay, what is everybody doing? What should we as a community be doing to help FDA develop really good guidance? And so that's essentially been the question that has brought people to the table to form our collaborative. And essentially we just formed it. And you know, in the first meeting, you know, we said, you know, here's our first framework that I just showed you all. Here's what FDA needs to do. What do you all think we really need to focus on over the next year? And two things that came up was around the credibility of observational studies and data quality. So people say, well, you know, what about randomization? You know, you need to really focus on randomization. And, you know, essentially folks at the FDA said, well, if you do a really good study that includes randomization, we have a mechanism for looking at that data, and we, you know, if it's a randomized study, it essentially falls into what we're used to doing, and they're essentially within the agency. There's no question about whether or not that would be a good design. I mean, of course, you still have to look at how it was designed and the data quality and all of those things. But if it's a randomized design, we're not concerned. We don't have that question of whether or not we could use it necessarily, because we know how to look at randomized studies. So focus became on observational studies, especially observational studies where you're looking at benefit as opposed to just safety. That's where we have a lot of question. We're not sure when we look at an observational study, is it good? Are the data good? You know, what is the best way to do an observational study? How do you know when you can rely on an observational study versus rely on it? So those were where the real questions were coming from, not just from FDA, but from the industry too. So our first high priority project sort of focus on that. What does a highly credible observational study look like? And how do we sort of proceed with data quality? Real-world data by nature come from all different kinds of sources. Some are standardized, some are not. They're just sort of all over the place. How do we think about data quality? And particularly from the FDA's perspective, what's good enough? And so those were the primary questions that were sort of giving rise to these two high priority projects. So on the, this is a work in progress, but I wanted to show it anyway. So on the question of not just data quality, but the credibility of observational studies. We're sort of thinking about it so far in almost two dimensions. One is the rigor itself. Analytic techniques, method, you know, if it's retrospective, propensity score matching and weighting and, you know, all of these different kinds of analytic techniques that go along with the study design to really bring forth rigorous studies. But then there are some process questions that also lend themselves to increasing the credibility of observational data. Like, you know, was your analytic plan or your protocol published ahead of time? How, you know, we know for traditional randomized control designs on the drug side, FDA has a evidentiary standard of substantial evidence. That's what's in law. And so that's in legislation. In regulation, FDA has interpreted substantial evidence to mean 2 well-designed randomized controlled trials, okay? But if we're talking about observational studies, what does that mean? 3 really good observational studies is equivalent to 2 randomized, you know, or maybe it's 4. Or maybe it's 2 observational studies and completely separate data systems where at least one of those was able to replicate a trial. You know, there could be many different ways of interpreting that, but that's a question. Like, what would actually constitute substantial evidence when you're looking at randomized design? We don't know the answer, but that's a question to not just ask FDA, but ask researchers and experts in doing real-world evidence what makes sense and come to consensus around what does substantial evidence look like. So that's more of a process thing. How many studies did you do? Were your results not necessarily the study reproducible, but were the results consistent with each other? Are they, in the different data environments, are they going in the same direction? You may not get the same effect size, but are they going in the same direction? So those 2 things are what we're exploring in terms of coming to some consensus on what credibility looks like in observational designs. So on data quality, number one, we recognize this is not the first time people have been looking at data quality for real-world data. If you know anything about ISPOR, or ISBE or HRQ, the EDM Forum, PCORNet. I think you guys know a little bit about. Lots of different organizations have been looking at data quality. Maybe not through the lens of a regulator, but essentially in doing really good research. What do you mean by data quality? So our first step was to look at all of these different organizations and look like, what have they published? And sort of almost like plot it out. What was consistent among all 7 organizations? Where are their gaps? What's not consistent? And we thought that would give us a good starting point to talk about, okay, when we're talking about data quality from a regulator's perspective, where are the gaps and where should we move forward? So here's an example of a grid that we're just starting to build out, where across the columns you have the 7 different source documents that we're using where other organizations have tried to come to consensus, but among themselves are not consistent necessarily. And then going down the table will be sort of the standards or the principles of data quality. This project is going to take many years if we think that we're going to come out with a report that says, in this electronic health record data system in this hospital, here's what we think about the quality. And then in this claims database versus the 20 other different types of claims databases, here are the ones that are higher quality, here are the ones that we're not going to do that. But what we are going to do is look at, so what are the principles of data quality? If you're the first time looking at these data, or you're the FDA and somebody submits a data and evidence package that includes a mixture of claims data and electronic health record data, what are the dimensions or the principles of quality that the FDA should be looking to see if the researchers addressed? And so by looking at those different organizations, let me back up, there were 4 key theme areas: historical experience, data for research purposes, clinical granularity, and then representativeness and completeness, and data validation. So I'm going to quickly go through what we mean by those. So in terms of historical experience, these were like, historical accessibility. How long has that data source been available to researchers? How easy is it for researchers to access the data? Has that data environment itself had data validation? What sort of level of validation goes into those data? And has it been used as a source in peer-reviewed articles? Presumably, this is that if it's been used before by researchers and it's been good enough to publish in literature, it must be good. And so you say 4 out of 7. So four sort of consensus documents out of those 7 that sort of had something related to use of source in peer-reviewed article. The 2 out of 7 in terms of historical accessibility, that means 2 different organizations out of the 7 that we looked at had that. None of this is to say that this is good stuff or that we should include this. This is just what's been done so far. Clinical granularity, it's pretty clear. Do you have the necessary data that you need in terms of clinical detail to do the study? And you see, pretty much 5 to 6 out of the 7 had something related to clinical granularity. The third area is representativeness and completeness, sufficient number of subjects, data missingness, and all of those issues. Those are almost slam dunks that should be part of data quality. We're not going to debate these, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but just to give you an overview. And then data validation is clearly an issue and something that should be looked at. And you can see accuracy of the data, surprise, all 7 organizations thought that would be important. Plausibility, consistency, et cetera, those seem to be clear. But so we saw some gaps that as we brought the groups together more recently and said, here's what we saw so far, what do you all think? And a lot of them said, well, geez, this is, if you look at when these were published, and then when they were published, sort of the data that they were used to at the point, we're talking about like 5, 10 years, even more ago. And now we have sort of the age of bringing data together, integrating data, linking claims with electronic health records, et cetera. We sort of have evolved, and and new questions arise in terms of data provenance and that traceability. So once you have your analytic data set that you're going to do your study on, chances are it's been transformed multiple times before since it came from the source. So electronic health record data, the source is actually at the hospital where the record is. But you sort of pool the necessary data elements into a data warehouse, and then you might actually transform variables to get to an analytic data set. And then maybe you bought that data set from something, group like Optum, okay? So you have to de-identify it. So then you have this analytic de-identified data set, and the question is, well, what if you have questions? Can you go back to the source? Do you know how that data got to where you are? Do you have traceability to go all the way back and understand how were that data transformed, and the meaning of the data may have changed? Many of the groups before didn't really address that issue well, and our advisory group said we really need to look at this stuff, because that's where you can really have some significant data issues if you don't understand the source, or you don't know how the data were transformed by the time you're ready to analyze it. Then you have significant issues. So these emerging dimensions sort of cover the data provenance, transparency in terms of how data were converted, et cetera. And so that's going to be a big part of moving forward in terms of how we think about data quality. Okay, and I'm actually doing pretty well on time, which is surprising. I thought I'd be running over. I thought I'd have to skip section 4. Okay, so let's talk about value-based payments. So, one thing that I've noticed is that, real-world data and evidence are not new. We've been doing this kind of research for decades. It used to be called comparative effectiveness research, and then it was called health outcomes and pharmacoeconomics, and all of these different terms. Sort of now the new buzzword is real-world evidence, but it's not new. And so, the question is, what all of a sudden is going to take? And what we realize is that we don't have a great infrastructure for collecting the data and developing the evidence very efficiently. And one, I would say, really great thing that we've been seeing is that because of the 21st Century Cures and the PDUFA commitments, and the sort of focus on using real-world evidence at the FDA, suddenly there's a lot of attention on the topic, and companies are really wanting to get this right and get involved. And so the sort of the energy around, at least from what I'm experiencing, is really high around real-world evidence. And so there's an opportunity for the private sector and the public sector to invest in a better way of collecting data and bringing the data together. So the infrastructure, the sort of the underlying infrastructure to develop real-world evidence has a lot of opportunity. And so once you have that, then that's great. And you can use that data and evidence for other important areas of healthcare, like clinical decision making, or actually getting to higher value healthcare and the way that we pay for drugs and devices. So alternative payment models are typically, as we think about, people think, we spend a lot for our healthcare system in the United States today, and many wonder, are we getting the value that are we getting the outcomes and the value that we should be getting given how much we spend on our healthcare system? And most people agree we're probably not. And so that sort of spurred the emphasis of getting away from fee-for-service reimbursement and more to value-based care. And so you hear terms like accountable care organizations and bundled payments and episodic payments that are linked to measures of quality. And those are typically on the way that we pay and reimburse for healthcare services, either at the provider level or at the health system level. But we haven't really been talking too much about drug payments. And so thinking about how you might bring the alternative payment model sort of mentality to the way that we pay for drug payments, the way that we pay for drugs and devices is fairly new. Although there are some examples of sort of value-based payments for drugs and devices, but it's pretty new. And so we formed a consortium at the Duke Margolis Center called the sort of Value-Based Payment Consortium for Medical Products. And similar to our RealWorld Evidence Collaborative, it sort of has companies, large public and private payers. CMS is a contributor, as well as several private plans, patient groups, and health systems, sort of figuring out, how can we get to a better state of having value-based payments for drugs and devices? So instead of paying for the drug because that's what the price is, why don't we just pay for the outcome? So if we have better outcomes, then we pay what we should be paying. If the outcomes aren't there, maybe we shouldn't be paying so much. So that concept makes a lot of sense, but it turns out it's hard to implement. And so one of the reasons why it's so hard is because we don't have the data and evidence. So the real-world evidence really isn't there to know if the drug is really working the way that we expected it to. And there are some other barriers too. I'll cover really quickly, but it is a big opportunity for better real-world data and evidence systems to support payment on the drug and device side as well. So we came up with a definition for what do I mean by value-based payment? And so our definition is that value-based payment arrangements for medical products are intended to align pricing and or payments to either observed or expected value in a population. So it's a little teased out there, observed or expected. Expected is, so there are essentially two different types of value-based payment models. One is, you might be familiar with indication-based pricing or evidence-based pricing. And essentially the concept there is that when you have the drug introduced to the market, you might have really good clinical trial data that shows how good that drug works in that indication. And if you're a payer and you're worried about, well, that's a good price for that indication, but I'm worried about off-label use, or once it's available, all these other different kinds of patients are going to be using it. We don't know if it works really well, and there's patients, so why should I be paying more in cases where I'm not even sure it's going to work? And so the idea behind evidence-based pricing is that you use that prior knowledge or that evidence from clinical trials to actually price the product. And then once it's priced, you essentially fall into fee-for-service where you pay that price no matter what happens. But presumably you like the price in a certain indication because it's evidence-based and ICER has looked at it and they said this is the right price, or these value assessment frameworks, there's new methodology for looking at different perspectives and determining what is a value-based price. The other kind is actually looking at, okay, once we start using that drug in the population, how do we link the actual results from that population to the payment? And so this is not the expected value, but it's the actual observed value. So if you have a new drug on the market like Spark Therapeutics, their new gene therapy for hereditary blindness, I think it's like $850,000. So the concept and sort of an outcomes-based contract would be, okay, well, we'll pay you the $850. It's a one-time gene therapy, so you just pay it once because that's when the procedure happens. But geez, we're not sure if that person's going to continue to be cured of blindness 30 days down the road, 60 days down the road, maybe 3 years down the road. So you institute sort of a rebate where if the patient doesn't demonstrate that they're still having benefit from that procedure, the payer would get money back. So that's one way of saying, okay, well, we're not sure what the outcomes are going to be, and it's really high price, but is there a way to sort of protect against that uncertainty that what if the drug doesn't work? And so outcomes-based contracts can be a way to do that. I'm going to skip to our, there's where that is. So we formed this payment consortium, and I talked a little bit about the gene therapy, but we have a medical devices work group and a pharmaceuticals work group. And the whole point of this consortium is to look across all of the barriers to getting value-based payment arrangements more commonplace. And so we have our advisory group, we have some work groups, and we've put together a range of deliverables that we're in the midst of developing. But one of those is sort of like, how do we actually think about these evidence-based pricing or outcomes-based contracts? The way I sort of communicate is like you either have one or the other. But in reality, there's sort of a range of opportunities under these different types of payment arrangements that you might see. And there's been some, and I'm not going to name the companies or the drugs, but there have been some press releases around outcomes-based contracts. When you actually look at them, you say, those aren't really value-based. I mean, essentially what the company does is they know how often the drug is going to fail on average, and they just price it up knowing that they're going to have to give so many rebates. And then the question is that really value-based? And then you actually get contracts like, presumably what Spark and what Novartis recently went out with the CAR-T and the Luxturna, the blindness gene therapy. and say, well, that's actually, that's getting closer to value because we're really talking about meaningful outcomes in terms of cure rates and clinical response and significant opportunities for savings if these products don't work. But is that the goal? Should we be looking for those kinds of arrangements? Well, we're thinking about more of a spectrum and how to describe these sort of outcome-based arrangements. And the way we're at least initially thinking about it now is think about like 4 different categories of payments. Category 1 is what we have today, which is fee for service. Here's the price, you just pay it. Patient goes in to collect the prescription at the pharmacy, or physician uses the drug as an infusion or an injection, and every time the drug is given, you just pay the price. Category 2 is sort of getting into, okay, well, is there a way that we can be more transparent with that price or actually link that initial price to evidence that this drug actually works? And so this is more of the indication or evidence-based pricing, still free for service, but the price is actually linked to expected value. And then categories 3 and 4, which are over on the right-hand side, those are more of the outcomes-based contracts, where category 3 is traditional outcomes-based contracts that you've seen maybe in the press releases. 2 different ways of thinking of those. One would be, okay, you have an initial price and you define a period of time that you're going to allow for rebates, either shorter period like 60 or 30 days, or longer like 3 years, and say if the outcomes aren't achieved in the population getting the drug, then the manufacturer would pay back to the payer a significant amount of a significant rebate. It can't be more than 23% of the sort of ASP price of the drug, because if it's a rebate that's more than that, then there's a little rule that says that then the company has to offer that bigger rebate to all of the state Medicaid programs, called Medicaid Best Price. And so as a result of that, companies are only going to offer a discount that's less than 23% off of the price. Does that make sense? Because if it's more than that, they're afraid that the whole Medicaid program would get that deeply discounted price. Well, that doesn't make sense, because you say, well, that's only the price if the drug fails. Well, we have Medicaid Best Price that's in the legislation and the interpretation of it in regulation, and that's been a significant barrier, and companies are unwilling to provide more of a discount than that because of this issue. Another way of doing it is sort of paying over time, that if you have a one-time gene therapy intervention, instead of paying all $850,000 now, maybe there's a way that you could pay over 5 years, like lower payments on annual rate, as long as the drug keeps working. So if you get to 3 years out and the drug's not working anywhere, you don't have to make any more payments. So that's another way to link the payment to the actual effectiveness of the drug. And then moving over to category 4 is sort of what we're thinking of, more population-based, where you actually get providers, manufacturers, and payers sort of sit at the table together and say, what's a meaningful way that we can share risk? So providers can go at risk for the outcomes that they're accountable for. Manufacturers can go at risk for the outcomes that their product is accountable for. And that's a way to sort of align the goals in terms of what outcomes are we trying to achieve with this patient population, and sharing risk among payers, manufacturers, and provider system. There aren't really any good examples of that. But our collaborators see this as the future of moving more towards a learning healthcare system, and one that can deliver better value. So we're looking for opportunities to sort of describe what this might look like, and there are a couple health systems that are more integrated delivery systems that are interested in piloting these kinds of arrangements. And so those will be interesting and things to look for as our consortium continues. So just, this is my last slide actually on the value-based payment work, and essentially some of the factors influencing payment reform side, on the medical product side, this is more the technology itself and what's the uncertainty. If it's a really high-priced technology, but you have very little uncertainty, like it's really going to work in this patient population, then maybe an indication-based price makes sense. So you're basically paying for what you know is going to happen in terms of the outcomes. If the drug gets used in a different tumor type or in a different indication, then perhaps the price back to the manufacturer is much lower, because essentially you're paying for better outcomes. Whereas if you have a high-priced drug and you're just not sure, you're worried about, like, what if I pay all this money for the drug and it actually doesn't work? So there's a lot of uncertainty, and it's almost a situation where we have asymmetric knowledge from the manufacturer of the product who really stands behind their product and the payer who's like, 850,000, I'm not even sure. Your clinical trial was only 2 years long and you're promising a cure for blindness over the patient's lifetime. I'm not sure if that's going to happen. So you might institute something like an outcomes-based contract where you pay the money, but there are defined points in time where you get some money back or you just pay over time. Operational factors are what we hear, aside from Medicaid best price and sort of other federal anti-kickback issues, legal and regulatory challenges for doing value-based payments. The biggest barrier has been it's really costly to collect the data. The manufacturers and payers don't have a common view of product performance because there isn't really data sharing happening. And it's hard to adjudicate pharmacy claims on medical data if they're not interacted or sort of integrated with each other. And so the cost for payers to set these things up and the cost for running the data systems to actually measure and monitor outcomes in the population and then adjudicate payment is just really costly to do. And it seems like every company that wants to go out with one of these, they have to build from scratch a new data system to actually track and measure these outcomes. And then on the regulatory side, which is not the focus of today, but we recently published a paper that addresses the 3 biggest regulatory and legal challenges to value-based payments. One of those challenges I already talked about, Medicaid best price. We have ideas on how that could be fixed either at the on the regulatory side or new language that would be needed on the legislative side to enable value-based payment arrangements to not run afoul of the Medicaid best price rule. The other one is federal anti-kickback statute. And then the third one is the way that FDA regulates off-label use. So the issue there is that, it's really hard for a company to go talk to a payer about information on their product that's not in the labeling. And so for a lot of these value-based payment arrangements, the data that the payer has are in the claims data. And so you might say, well, I'm going to here's the price for my drug, and you'll get like a rebate if the adherence of the drug is not where you expect it to be, or if the patient stops early, or other sort of process measures that aren't in the labeling. And the company would say, well, I can't really talk to payers about that because that's considered off-label if it's a claim that is not in the labeling. Or talk about, well, we should be really paying for measures that matter most to patients. So why don't we link the payment to quality of life outcomes or satisfaction or other sort of patient generated data? And the answer to that from the company would be, well, first of all, it's hard to measure that data, but assuming we can measure it, I'm going to get punished by the FDA or the Department of Justice because I'm talking to a payer about outcomes that aren't in the labeling. And so off-label outcomes that are easy to measure in the ambulatory setting that you might want to link payment to are sort of hard to do because of this sort of the regulation of off-label communication. But so there are a lot of opportunities in how FDA interprets sort of off-label communication. They're pending a few guidances right now and sort of reinterpreting some of the regulations around off-label communication. Hopefully that can alleviate some of the challenges on the value-based payment arrangement. So if you're talking about value-based payment arrangements, maybe there can be a safe harbor or a way to relax the off-label communication regulations to enable those payment opportunities to move forward. So oh, that wasn't my last slide. But these are just, so I'm not going to cover these because essentially I just talked about how difficult it is to determine what measures you want to measure and tie payment to and then to actually collect those data and infrastructure. Oh, and here's so where are some opportunities? Well, PCORnet, Sentinel, NEST is the National Evaluation System for Health Technology. It's like the new, Sentinel for devices. Registries, all of these things are sort of emerging opportunities to have a standing, ongoing infrastructure that is used in various ways now, Sentinel for safety and PCORnet for comparative effectiveness. None of these are used to sort of link to payment, but there might be opportunities for payers and provider systems that are contributing to these to actually reuse these kinds of infrastructures to support value-based payments as well, to make those agreements a little bit less costly to put forth. Okay, so and then I'm not going to talk about that. So, so I'll stop there and entertain any questions or comments. Thank you. Sure.
So we're open for questions. I mean, and I think that, you know, for knowing the type of research that that folks here do and the type of stuff that Greg was talking about, I do think that there are lots of opportunity of kind of experience from DCRI in terms of the data and the different sources to be thinking both about what we could be adding to the projects that are going on and also what might be possible pilot studies going forward with some of the ideas that are coming out of this group. But would love to have any questions. Yeah.
Great talk, thank you very much.
Sure.
We see a lot of attention from companies and interest and investment in real-world data and real-world evidence. What we also see is that there are no clear, in many companies, very clear directions. Many are going in different directions and putting their attention in different areas. And there's also an enormous amount of hype, good advice, not a lot of unbiased advice. How do we connect with these companies beyond the companies that you're already engaged with and having dialogue with, and sort of spread the word and get more people involved in more objective thinking about these approaches?
Yeah, that's a great comment and question. And you know, part of the issue is the lack of regulatory guidance right now. So because FDA hasn't gone out there to say, here's what we're expecting, the researchers within companies, and as you know, within any pharmaceutical company, you have the epi people, and then you have the health outcomes people, and then you have the people who do the clinical trials. And the people who do the clinical trials are like, we're going to stay we know how to do clinical trials. We're going to keep doing that. Let's not try to, you know, bring in uncertainty around what if we do this really expensive observational study and it's not even deemed to be acceptable. Whereas the people who are used to observational studies within a company are saying, well, here's what we should do, and here's what. So you end up even within a company going in different directions, and all of that is expected to happen when you don't have guidance from the agency. And so it really does put a lot of importance on the agency in 2021 to get that guidance out and to get it right. And one thing that we don't want to have happen is the FDA to sort of go into a closed room and develop the guidance on their own and then say, here it is. And they're not going to do that. They've been pretty open about working with us and working with the national academies. And so to the second part of your point is that, you know, we've engaged with a number of companies, so has the national academies, and we're planning to do a number over the next couple of years, public engagement opportunities to bring in even more companies to describe what we're doing, to get input from not just companies, but payers and patient groups as well. Because we do need to get to some consensus on these principles that then FDA can use in their guidances. Yeah.
So I'm sorry I came in late from clinic, so I missed the first part of your presentation. But it's a great topic, and to add to what David was saying, there's so many sources of data now that we call real-world evidence, and the pharmaceutical companies don't know what to do with them. They just tend to purchase data from a variety of sources and think that helps them figure out what's going on in the marketplace. But in most cases, they seem misguided and are coming up with wrong conclusions. And I agree with what you say, that they're siloed into groups that do trials, that do observational studies and others, and they don't link those together. And so there's little innovation across either one in that regard.
Yeah.
But I also think the FDA is just far too draconian right now in terms of, you know, their policies of what can happen once a drug's on label and how it can be promoted and what they can do in terms of the payment options. And so it's nice to hear that they're reconsidering their guidances, but it should happen within a year, not 3 to 4 years, at least in my opinion. And it's also hard at the FDA to figure out who you should talk to about this, because we're used to talking to the people who regulate clinical trials, but not to the groups who then are following what happens after a drug's approved and on the market. And I think, you know, the siloing of the FDA and the fact that they don't even talk to each other within the FDA is a big hindrance, because they don't know what the other groups are doing. And so there's a lot of problem there. And I know some people here used to work at the FDA, and I think there's a lot of room that they could improve. And then the interactions between companies and the FDA, I think, would be on a much higher level.
Yeah.
So this is a question for Gillian. So you mentioned at the start of the talk the need for investigators to start thinking about policy implications of their work. And I think there are some out there who might say that there should be a pretty bright line between people who generate the evidence and those who take it and use it for policy purposes. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the role of the investigator in that translation, and if there is a role, sort of how clinical investigators should be thinking about that when you sort of put pen to paper and start actually writing a proposal. How should the policy implication consideration come in? And where should it come in?
Right. Well, I mean, I think that there are, there's a few things. Like if you're doing like a normal NIH grant, there it's not as it's not a normal part to have at the end. We normally now have like a dissemination plan, but the dissemination is not normally, we're going to disseminate this into policy. It's more like we're going to use this that potentially policymakers could use to inform their policy. That being said, I think there's a lot of other funding mechanisms that would be more open to kind of the actual, we're going to really translate this into policy. And certainly in today's funding, with the kind of ups and downs of funding, looking at some of those other kind of foundation funding or other groups like that that would really kind of incorporate that as a specific aim. As I'm not only going to look at the these first two that are looking at clinical outcomes, but then I'm actually going to then try to figure out how to actually translate into policy, I think would be more accepted. But I do think that, from the research side, we're not really used to working kind of the speed that's needed for policy, and also thinking about all the regulations and things that Greg and his group are used to working on. And so I think that that's where, when we try to look at the impact that our work is doing and how it's actually getting translated, sometimes the fact that we're not thinking about those policy things and what it's actually really going to take this really great effectiveness work and actually get it into policy. I think that working with folks that are more familiar with that and bringing them as a part of the team is something that we're trying to encourage. I don't know if there's anything else.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. It's sort of, we have this sort of natural separation in the way that the center is designed for good or for bad, where in DC you have more of the sort of the very policy-oriented focus groups of folks who are used to engaging with Hill staff, engaging with the agencies, CMS, FDA, and then a lot of folks here in Durham that are extremely good researchers and actually develop the evidence that then goes into policy. And what we're trying to do as a center is to integrate that, so not have a geographic divide, but sort of integrate those pieces of the expertise into each project and into all of the work that we do.
Right. And to have faculty that aren't even, that kind of don't even think of that as that last step, to then realize that last step could exist, and there might be staff and other faculty members that would be interested in taking those lessons and actually helping them with that process. Because some of them aren't going to work on developing those skills, but would love to see that kind of step happen if they have the right collaborators.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.